There are questions that prison walls were never meant to answer. Questions about what happens when a system built for punishment must also sustain new life. Somewhere in America, right now, a pregnant woman is sitting inside a cell. She is not alone, and yet she is utterly, completely alone. If you've never heard this story, you need to subscribe. Share this with someone who should know, because what you're about to learn has been buried for decades inside institutional silence. The United States incarcerates more people than any nation on Earth. That number includes tens of thousands of women, many of them pregnant upon arrival. According to documented reports, an estimated 58,000 pregnant women pass through American correctional facilities every single year. That figure is not an estimate born from advocacy. It comes from institutional research. And yet, what happens to those women and those children remains largely invisible. The story begins, as so many do, with a document almost nobody read, a legal journal, a researcher, a set of facts arranged so quietly they barely registered as alarm. Douglas Ankeny spent months reviewing cases, appeals, testimony, and medical records. What he found was not the result of isolated bad actors or rogue officers. What he found was a pattern. Women arriving at county jails, not even sentenced. Many still awaiting trial discovered they were pregnant after booking. Some already knew. Some did not. In either case, the institutional machinery responded the same way, with indifference. There are women who gave birth shackled to a bed, not metaphorically, literally restrained during active labor, medical staff present, officers present, and still, the restraints stayed on. These are not allegations. These are documented in court filings, medical records, and sworn testimony, phrase that surfaces again and again in these reports is chilling in its simplicity. The value of human life in prison is worth less, not a conclusion drawn by critics alone, but echoed quietly in the institutional responses, the delayed care, the denied appointments, the miscarriages that followed inadequate attention. In county jails especially, the situation becomes acute. County facilities are short-term, underfunded, and often medically under-equipped. Prenatal care, vitamins, monitoring, nutritional support requires planning. Most jails never built into their structure. When pregnant women arrived, facilities often responded with what they had, almost nothing. One case, pulled from public court records, describes a woman who reported labor symptoms repeatedly. Officers logged her complaints. A supervisor reviewed them. The medical response took hours. By the time a physician examined her, the situation had already changed in ways that could not be undone. What happened in those hours is disputed. What is not disputed is the outcome. These are not stories from a forgotten era. They are recent. Some are ongoing. And the women at the center of them carry something most victims of systemic failure do not. They carry the evidence of what happened to them, or they carry its absence. This documentary does not claim to know every truth buried inside these institutions, but it will follow the documented trail as far as it goes, into the fluorescent corridors, into the paper trails, into the silence where accountability should be. The questions raised here deserve answers. The women inside these walls, and the children born within them, deserve witnesses. Asterisk. The process begins before a woman ever sees a cell. It begins at the intake desk, under fluorescent lights, with a clipboard and a series of questions. Are you currently taking any medications? Do you have any medical conditions? Are you pregnant? The answers are logged, stamped, filed. And in facility after facility, that is where the care ends. Intake screening for pregnant women in American jails varies dramatically depending on geography. In some large urban facilities, a nurse is present during booking. In smaller county jails, which hold the majority of incarcerated women, medical staff may only visit on scheduled days. If a woman arrived on a Tuesday and the nurse came on Thursdays, 2 days passed without any clinical assessment, to days in which complications could begin quietly and visibly behind a locked door. Researchers who reviewed intake protocols across multiple states found something deeply consistent. The identification of pregnancy happened, more often than not, without triggering any formalized care pathway. A positive answer on the intake form should activate a chain of responses. Prenatal vitamins, dietary adjustments, scheduling of obstetric appointments, Monitoring. Documentation reviewed by Ankney and others showed that chain frequently broke at the first link. There is a term used in correctional medicine, continuity of care. It refers to the uninterrupted management of a patient's health across time and setting. For pregnant women entering the justice system, that continuity often shattered the moment handcuffs closed. A woman with an established obstetrician on the outside suddenly had no access to that physician. Her records did not automatically transfer. Her appointments did not automatically continue. She entered a system that was not designed to absorb her specific, urgent medical reality. The nutritional dimension alone is damning. Pregnancy requires significant caloric and nutritional adjustment. Increased iron, folate, calcium, protein. Standard jail food trays are calibrated for cost, not clinical need. Multiple lawsuits filed across different states describe pregnant inmates receiving the same meals as the general population. In some documented cases, requests for dietary modification were denied, delayed, or simply never processed. There is a particular cruelty embedded in bureaucratic indifference. It does not announce itself. It does not raise its voice. It simply fails to act, and calls that failure procedure. Women in these documented cases did not describe dramatic confrontations with hostile officers. They described asking, waiting, asking again, waiting longer. They described a system that processed their requests the same way it processed everything else. Slowly, partially, and without urgency. Some facilities contracted their medical care out to private vendors. Those vendors operated under cost control, incentives that did not always align with patient need. Internal communications obtained through litigation in several cases revealed approval chains for specialist referrals. An obstetrician visit was not a guaranteed right. It was a request that required authorization that could be denied, appealed, reconsidered, while a pregnancy continued and monitored inside a concrete room. The women who survived these systems and later spoke to researchers described a particular kind of psychological weight. Not just fear for themselves, fear for something they could not yet hold, could not yet see, could not yet protect. They were inside a facility designed to restrict agency, and the most urgent act of their lives, growing. Another human being required exactly the kind of agency the system was specifically built to remove. That tension sits at the center of every case in this documentary. Not evil, not malice, always. Something in many ways more difficult to confront. A system operating exactly as it was designed, and that design leaving no room for the life growing silently inside it. There is one case that appears in various forms across multiple legal reviews. A woman, her name protected in court filings, arrived at a mid-sized county jail in her second trimester. Her intake form noted the pregnancy. A nurse was notified. Weeks passed. What happened during those weeks, and what failed to happen, would eventually become the subject of a federal civil rights complaint. That case does not end where most people would expect it to. It ends somewhere darker, and far more revealing about the institutions we have built. There is a moment in every institutional failure when someone new, not suspected, not worried, knew, and the document that should have traveled upward stayed exactly where it was. Labor does not announce itself with clarity inside a jail cell. The early signs of cramping, pressure, irregular pain can be dismissed. By the woman herself, conditioned to minimize complaints in an environment that punishes vulnerability. By officers and trained in obstetric assessment, following protocols that were never written for this. By a system that processes medical requests the same way it processes everything else. Through channels, through forms, through time. Across multiple documented cases, a pattern emerges with haunting consistency. A woman reports symptoms. An officer logs the report. The log moves to a supervisor. The supervisor contacts medical staff. Medical staff is sometimes on site, sometimes available only by phone. Make an initial assessment remotely. That assessment determines the urgency of response. And in case after case, that remote assessment underestimated what was actually happening inside that cell. *1 detail surfaces repeatedly in legal testimony and civil rights complaints. The distance between a jail cell and adequate obstetric care is not merely physical. It is structural. Hospitals require transport authorization. Transport requires officers. Officers require scheduling. By the time that chain completed itself, outcomes had already shifted. In some cases, permanently. Shackling during pregnancy is perhaps the most viscerally documented aspect of this crisis. Despite legislation in dozens of states explicitly prohibiting the restraint of pregnant inmates during labor and delivery, violations continued to be reported. Federal reviews and advocacy organization investigations documented women restrained during active labor, some during transport to hospitals. Some on delivery tables. Officers cited security protocol. Medical staff, in some documented cases, did not intervene. The legal architecture on this issue is genuinely complex. Correctional officers operate under institutional liability frameworks that incentivize protocol compliance over clinical judgment. To remove restraints is to assume responsibility for any security incident that follows. The calculus inside those rooms was not always about the woman on the table. It was about paperwork, about procedure, about who would be held accountable if something went wrong. The cruelest irony is that something already was going wrong. Children were born into this system, some healthy, despite everything. Some not. Court records describe neonatal outcomes ranging from healthy deliveries under difficult circumstances to tragedies that became the basis for wrongful death litigation. The cases that reached litigation represent only a fraction of the actual incidents. Many women, upon release, lacked the resources to pursue legal action. Many did not know they had standing to file. Many simply carried what happened and kept moving, because that is what survival requires. There is something that the official reports do not capture: the silence afterward. The woman who returned to her cell hours after delivering a child she would not be permitted to keep. The infant transferred to state custody, or to a family member, or to a foster system already stretched beyond capacity. The mother left with a body that had just done the most profound thing a human body can do. Inside a room built for punishment. Researchers who interviewed formerly incarcerated mothers described a particular kind of grief, not the grief of loss exactly, though that was present, to the grief of having experienced something irreplaceable in a context designed to strip meaning from everything. The first moments of a child's life, witnessed through institutional procedure, measured not in tenderness but in security classifications. This is the point in the investigation where the trail grows cold. Where records go missing, where officials decline to comment. Where the women most central to these events are hardest to reach, as scattered by release, relocation, poverty, and the simple exhaustion of having survived. The evidence exists. The pattern is documented, but the accountability of the named, consequence-bearing institutional accountability remains largely absent, and that absence is not accidental. If these stories remain visible, they would demand a response. The walls of these facilities were never designed to be transparent. They were designed to contain. What they contained, in these cases, was not just women awaiting trial or serving sentences. It was evidence of a system that looked at the most vulnerable human circumstance imaginable and chose procedure over life. If this investigation has moved you, share it. The women in these cases had no platform. This one exists because of every person who watches, subscribes, and refuses to let these stories disappear, because the next chapter reveals something the institutions worked hardest to keep hidden. And once you see it, you will understand why so few ever did. Asterisk: every institution leaves a record. Not always the recorded intended to leave. Sometimes the most revealing documents are the ones filed quietly, never expecting to be read. The legal history surrounding pregnant incarcerated women in America is longer than most people realize. It stretches back decades, through federal court rulings, state legislative sessions, and administrative policy revisions. On paper, the protections exist. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Estelle v. Gamble, decided by the Supreme Court in 1976, established that deliberate indifference to serious medical needs constitutes a constitutional violation. Pregnancy, by any clinical definition, qualifies as a serious medical need, and yet the gap between legal standard and institutional reality proved, in case after case, to be vast. Deliberate indifference is a high legal bar. Prosecutors and plaintiffs must demonstrate not merely that care was inadequate, but that officials were consciously aware of a serious risk and chose to disregard it. That standard, designed to protect against frivolous claims, created something else in practice, a threshold that institutional behavior could remain just below: poor care, delayed care, insufficient care, but documented, processed, technically addressed, just slowly enough, and just inadequately enough to avoid the precise legal definition of deliberate indifference. The paper trail tells this story with painful clarity. Requests logged but never escalated. Medical visits scheduled but repeatedly postponed. Referrals submitted through authorization. Chains that moved at institutional pace while biological clocks moved at their own. Lawyers reviewing these files described a particular sensation: the discovery of obvious wrongdoing, the discovery of a system that had learned, over years of litigation, exactly how much it could fail without crossing a line. Some states moved to address the shackling issue directly through legislation. By the early 2020s, more than 30 states had laws on the books restricting or prohibiting the restraint of pregnant inmates during labor and delivery. Federal legislation addressed the issue. Within the federal prison system, advocates celebrated these as genuine progress. Then the compliance reports began to surface. The distance between a law's existence and its enforcement inside a correctional facility can be considerable. Officer training on anti-shackling statutes was documented as inconsistent across jurisdictions. In some facilities, policies had been updated on paper but never communicated meaningfully to floor staff. In others, officers reported being unaware that such laws applied to their facility at all. Litigation continued. Documented violations continued. The laws existed. The practice persisted. Civil rights organizations began systematic documentation efforts in the mid-2010s. The ACLU, the National Women's Law Center, and prison reform advocacy groups compiled case files, interviewed formerly incarcerated women, and submitted public records requests to facilities across the country. What they received and what they were denied was itself illuminating. Some facilities produced records promptly and completely. Others cited exemptions, delayed responses, or produced documents so heavily redacted they yielded almost nothing. The pattern of disclosure mapped, with uncomfortable precision, onto the pattern of reported violations. The facilities with the most to hide were the least forthcoming with documentation. There is a specific category of document that appears in several major cases: internal incident reports, of facility's own account of what happened during a medical emergency. These reports are written by officers, reviewed by supervisors, and filed in institutional archives. They are not written for public consumption. They are not written anticipating litigation. They are written to account for what occurred on a given shift. And in multiple cases, the discrepancy between these internal reports and subsequent official statements became the foundation of successful civil rights complaints. One reviewed case involved an internal incident report that described a woman in clear distress for a documented period before medical intervention arrived. Official statement released after a subsequent complaint described the response as prompt and appropriate. The timestamps in the incident report told a different story. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just numbers on a page, recording the distance between a cry for help and a response. That distance, measured in minutes, became the center of a federal filing. The medical vendors who contracted with these facilities maintained their own separate documentation. Those records were private corporate documents, not subject to the same public records requests as government facilities. Obtaining them required litigation. Litigation required resources that most of the women at the center of these cases did not have. What the paper trail ultimately reveals is not a conspiracy. It reveals something more mundane and more systemic: a series of institutions, each operating within its own accountability framework, each technically compliant with its own stated procedures. And in the spaces between those frameworks, in the gaps between the jail's responsibility and the hospital's, between the medical vendor's obligation and the facilities, women fell, quietly, documentably, repeatedly. The records exist, buried in court archives, civil rights organization files, and the personal testimony of women who survived long enough to speak. What they described is not invisible. It simply requires someone willing to look. Asterisk. There is a category of consequence that no legal filing fully captures. It begins at birth and extends outward across years, sometimes across generations. It belongs to the children. Some were born healthy, delivered under difficult circumstances, inside institutions not designed for birth, by women navigating fear and pain without adequate support, but alive, present, beginning. Those children were, in most cases, transferred almost immediately to a waiting family member if one had been arranged, to foster care if not. The separation happened quickly, by institutional design. A newborn inside a correctional facility represents a classification problem the system resolves through removal. The research on maternal-infant separation in the hours and days after birth is substantial and consistent. Early bonding, physical contact, feeding. The sound of a mother's voice has documented neurological significance for newborn development. The disruption of that bonding carries measurable consequences. Not theoretical, not speculative. Documented in pediatric research, developmental psychology, and longitudinal studies spanning decades. For children born into the correctional system, that disruption was not an exception. It was procedure. Some facilities operated nursery programs. A small number of states developed prison nursery initiatives allowing incarcerated mothers to keep infants with them for a defined period, typically ranging from several months to approximately 18 months. Evaluations of these programs showed meaningful positive outcomes for both mothers and children, reduced recidivism among participating mothers, stronger developmental indicators among participating children. The evidence base for these programs was genuine, and yet they remained rare, underfunded, and available only to a small fraction of the women who could have benefited. The majority of children born to incarcerated mothers entered the child welfare system. That system is its own world of complexity, resource limitation, and institutional pressure. Foster care placements are not guaranteed to be stable. Sibling groups are frequently separated. The legal timeline for termination of parental rights, which can accelerate under certain circumstances for incarcerated parents, means that some women lost legal custody of their children before they were released from the facility where those children were born. There is a federal law that makes this dynamic particularly acute. The Adoption and Safe Families Act, passed in 1997, requires states to initiate termination of parental rights proceedings when a child has been in foster care for 15 of the most recent 22 months. For women serving sentences longer than that threshold, the law creates a structural collision between incarceration and parenthood. A woman could be incarcerated, could be compliant with every facility rule, could be doing everything asked of her and still lose her child to legal termination simply because her sentence exceeded a statutory calendar. Researchers and advocates who studied these cases describe the psychological impact in terms that clinical language struggles to contain. Women who had given birth inside these facilities and lost custody of those children carried a particular category of trauma. Not the trauma of violence, necessarily, the trauma of legal machinery operating exactly as designed, and that design producing an outcome that felt, to the person living it, like erasure. The children grew up with questions. Some knew early. Some discovered the circumstances of their birth later, through documents, through relatives, through their own research. The stories of how they processed that knowledge vary as widely as the children themselves. But something surfaces consistently in the accounts of those who spoke to researchers: a desire to understand not just what happened, but why no one stopped it. That question does not have a clean answer. It has a structural one. Nobody stopped it because stopping it required a system to assess itself and find itself inadequate. It required institutions to prioritize a category of person they were not designed to prioritize. It required a political will that, for decades, did not materialize in sufficient form. There are women alive today who were born inside American correctional facilities. Some know it, some do not. Some have found their mothers, some have not. Some carry the story as a wound. Some carry it as something more complicated, to origin point that holds grief and survival in the same space. One advocacy researcher, after years of working these cases, described a moment during an interview with a formerly incarcerated mother. The woman had given birth inside a county jail more than a decade earlier. She had not seen her child since the transfer. She did not know with certainty where the child was. She had spent years building a life after release, working, stabilizing, surviving. But every year, on the date she calculated as her child's birthday, she stopped. Just stopped whatever she was doing, and thought about a face she had seen for only a few hours inside a room that was never meant for beginnings. Investigations and institutions continue. The documents get filed. The cases get settled or dismissed. The women get released or don't. And the system that produced every outcome described in this documentary keeps processing intakes, logging requests, and moving at its own pace. Reform efforts have been genuine in some places, not performative, not merely legislative. In certain jurisdictions, advocates, medical professionals, and correctional administrators work together with evident sincerity to improve conditions for pregnant incarcerated women. Prenatal care protocols were developed and implemented. Shackling prohibitions were enforced with actual training and accountability measures. Nursery programs were expanded cautiously, with documented positive results. These efforts matter. They should be acknowledged. They are also measured against the scale of the problem. Insufficient. The geography of reform is painfully uneven. A pregnant woman incarcerated in one state may receive consistent prenatal care, protected from restraint, with access to a nursery program. A pregnant woman incarcerated in a neighboring state may encounter the conditions documented throughout this investigation. Same country, same constitutional framework, same Eighth Amendment, different zip code, different outcome. The advocacy organizations that have fought these cases for decades describe a particular kind of exhaustion, not defeat. These are people who continue to file, to document, to litigate, but exhaustion born from repetition, from winning a case and watching the same pattern emerge in a different facility, from passing a law and discovering the law unenforceable without sustained political attention, from documenting a crisis clearly enough that no one could claim ignorance, and watching institutional inertia absorb that documentation without changing. There is a question that sits at the end of every investigation like this. Not the legal question, not the policy question, the human one. What does it mean that this happened? What does it mean that it continues? Not as abstraction, as specific lived experience, happening to specific women, producing specific consequences for specific children. The women who spoke to researchers and advocates over the years were not, in their own self-description, symbols. They were people who had made mistakes, or been accused of mistakes, or been caught in circumstances that the justice system processed according to its own logic. They did not enter custody expecting their pregnancies to become case studies. They entered custody the way most people enter custody, disoriented, frightened, and certain of what came next. What came next, and to many documented cases, was a failure that compounded every other difficulty they already faced. Some of those women became advocates. They found, after release, that the experience they most wanted to leave behind was also the experience that gave them the clearest understanding of what needed to change. They testified before legislative committees. They spoke to journalists. They sat across from researchers and described, with precision and without self-pity, what had happened inside those walls. Their testimony is part of the record now, permanent, documented, cited in legal filings and policy briefs. They turned what was done to them into evidence. The children born inside American correctional facilities are, today, growing up. Some are in elementary school. Some are teenagers. Some have reached adulthood. They carry, in their personal histories, an origin point most people will never have to explain. Some have found peace with it. Some have not. Some have found their mothers. Some are still looking. The full arc of what was set in motion in those delivery rooms, in those cells, in those institutional corridors, that arc is still unfolding. We are still inside it. What does accountability look like here? Not retribution. Not the satisfaction of a single named official facing consequence. Accountability In cases like these, looks like structural change. It looks like mandatory enforceable prenatal care standards in every facility that holds women. It looks like complete unambiguous prohibition on restraint during labor and delivery, with consequences for violation. It looks like nursery programs treated as standard, not exceptional. It looks like parental rights protections that account for the realities of incarceration. It looks like data, consistent, transparent, publicly available data on pregnant women in custody and their outcomes. It looks like a system that, when it takes a pregnant woman into its custody, understands that it has assumed responsibility for 2 lives. Douglas Anke's research did not resolve these cases. It illuminated them. Illumination is not resolution, but it is the necessary precondition. You cannot fix what you refuse to see. The fluorescent lights in those corridors are still on. The intake forms are still being filled out. Somewhere, right now, a woman is answering yes to a question on a clipboard. And what happens next depends, more than it should, on where she is, on which facility, which contract, which policy, which shift, on a geography of justice that has never been equal and has not yet been made so. That is where this investigation ends, not with resolution, with responsibility. The responsibility of knowing, because the distance between knowing and indifference, that distance is a choice, and it belongs, now, to all of us. If this documentary moved you, please share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe, so these investigations can continue reaching the people they need to reach. Leave a comment, and not just a reaction, but a thought. These stories deserve more than silence. The women documented here could not choose whether their stories became public record. You can choose what you do with them now. Watch the next documentary. Stay with these questions. Refuse the comfort of forgetting. That refusal is the least and the most that bearing witness requires.